Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching VMware Data Recovery version 2. In this lesson, I start off with an introduction to VMware Data Recovery version 2. This is the new version that's found in vSphere version 5. I'll talk about the new features as well as the limitations of VDR. I'll show you how to install VDR, perform the initial configuration, and then use VDR to back up and restore virtual machines in vSphere. So with that, let's get started. VMware Data Recovery is a VMware virtualization-specific backup and recovery application for VMware vSphere 4 and 5. It's easy to deploy as an appliance, and it integrates with vCenter. It's even administered through vCenter, or really with the vSphere client. It provides backup and restore of guest virtual machines, and it has advanced features like deduplication, file-level restore, and incremental and differential backup. It's included with vSphere Edition starting with Essentials Plus and moving on up to Standard, Enterprise, and Enterprise Plus. VMware Data Recovery is actually installed as a virtual appliance, so it's a virtual machine. It's fully contained within the virtual infrastructure, and it has its own Linux-like operating system. So it's an appliance you just import or deploy into the virtual infrastructure. You don't have to install a traditional Windows operating system and then a Windows application on top of that. So you deploy this virtual appliance, and then you also install a vSphere client plugin on your local computer, of course, that you're already running the vSphere client on. So there's no physical server and no client operating system to install, and it's fully integrated with vCenter. It works if virtual machines are powered on or off, so it can even back up powered off virtual machines. It uses snapshots for anytime backup, and it supports Microsoft's Volume Shadow services for Windows backup as well to ensure that you get virtual machine backups that have application integrity. It uses VADP, or the vSphere API for Data Protection Framework, so it's actually using vSphere's API for data protection, similar to what some other third-party backup tools do, but not all third-party backup tools. One of the things that I like about VMware Data Recovery is that it can back up the entire vSphere infrastructure in just a few clicks. There's no agents to install, and it works with any operating system supported by vSphere. It's also complete management of backup and recovery through the vSphere client, so you don't have to go to some other application to do it. You're doing backup and recovery right in your existing vSphere client. It's included with vSphere, starting with Essentials Plus and above, and it provides deduplication and compression automatically when it backs up the vSphere virtual machines. Before I cover the new features of VDR version 2 contained in vSphere 5, let me first review the features of VDR 1.2 that were last added in vSphere 4.1. VDR 1.2 offered Linux file level restore. It offered VSS in Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2 to ensure that you have application consistent backups. It supported up to 10 VDR virtual appliances per vCenter server, and each of those virtual appliances could back up to 100 virtual machines. So if you have 100 virtual machines or fewer in your virtual infrastructure, all you need is one VDR virtual appliance. But if you have more than 100, then you would use multiple VDR virtual appliances to back up those virtual machines in groups of 100. Another new feature in VDR 1.2 was that it could send its backup information to your local syslog server. Moving on to VDR version 2, new in vSphere 5, which I'll be demoing in this lesson. Now it uses CentOS 5.5, which is a 64-bit Linux-based operating system that's contained inside the virtual appliance when you deploy VDR. It provides you better scalability and better stability according to VMware. Also, swap files won't be included in your backups anymore, and this is going to save time both on backup and restore. VDR version 2 can perform integrity checks and reclaim operations on a schedule. They can also be resumed, and they can run in the background. Overall, performance of backups and other operations has been greatly improved with VDR version 2. And then lastly, email reporting has now been added so that you can get email alerts about the success or failure of your backups in the virtual infrastructure. Before I show you how to install VDR and how to back up and recover virtual machines with VDR, let me first review some of the limitations of VDR. The first one is that the backup data store is recommended to be no more than 1 terabyte of deduplicated data, and you have a maximum of 2 destinations total. You could have either a VMDK-based backup data store or a CIFS, which is just a Windows file share backup data store. If it's a VMDK-based backup data store, that 1 terabyte limit applies, but if it's a CIFS backup data store, there's a 500 megabyte maximum recommendation. You can have up to 8 concurrent VMDK backups going at one time, and there's a maximum of 100 virtual machines that can be backed up per VDR appliance. Of course, you can always add another VDR appliance, so you can back up more than 100 virtual machines with VDR, so don't make that mistake. It can back up more than 100 virtual machines. You just have to add another VDR appliance, and there's no additional cost for that. It's just another point of management. However, there is a hard maximum that you can only have up to 10 VDR appliances per vCenter server. So that would result in a maximum number of 1,000 virtual machines per vCenter server that can be backed up with VDR. Also, you should know that VDR isn't going to provide you a method to get your backup data onto tape or to get it off-site. That's something you're going to have to take care of yourself. You can unmount the backup data store, and then you could back up that data store using some other backup tool. That is a possibility, especially if it's just a CIFS file share. That's just a standard Windows file share that you could back up with any backup client, or even using a file copy to copy it over to, let's say, an external drive. And now we're at the point of installing VDR. You should know that there's a 60-day evaluation version of vSphere Enterprise Plus that comes with VDR included. Alternatively, if you already have a license of vSphere, you need to be using either Essentials Plus, Standard, Enterprise, or Enterprise Plus, or you should have purchased an a la carte version of VDR if you have vSphere Essentials. You can download VDR on the same page where you download vSphere, and VDR will be downloaded in a single file ISO format. So it's just a single ISO file. From there, you'll have to either burn that ISO file to some optical media or mount the ISO file using a tool like Magic ISO, or you can unzip the ISO to gain access to the files inside, again, with a third-party tool. And I'll show you how I get the files off the ISO. I actually mount that ISO onto the vCenter server virtual machine, and then I can gain access to the files. From there, I could use the local vSphere client on the vCenter server to deploy that OVF file inside the VDR ISO file, and then also share out that vSphere client plugin for VDR and access it with my local laptop that I use to administer my vSphere virtual infrastructure. So again, inside the ISO, you'll have the VDR appliance, which is in an OVF file format. You'll also have the VDR vSphere client plugin, which will be a Windows installation tool. So with that, let me show you the files that I downloaded to install VDR, and then we'll go over and mount that ISO file on my vCenter virtual machine. Here I am on the vSphere download page. Of course, here's ESXi, we've got vCenter, and just at the bottom of the vCenter list, this is where I found VMware Data Recovery. It's a 396 megabyte, it's an ISO file. I've gone ahead and already downloaded the ISO file, and I placed it on my desktop in a folder called Downloads. So now let me go over to my vSphere client, and let's use the console for the vCenter virtual machine, and I'm actually going to mount that ISO. This is the console for my vCenter virtual machine that I'm running inside my vSphere 5 virtual infrastructure. So I'm actually just going to use this to mount the ISO that I downloaded for VMware Data Recovery and get the files off. It's a very convenient way to do it without having to download some third-party tool like an ISO mounting tool. So I'm just going to go here to connect and disconnect the CD DVD drive, and I'm going to click on Connect to an ISO image on the local disk. Here's the VMware Data Recovery ISO file that I downloaded. I'll click Open there. And then it says, do you want to use the auto run or open the files and folders? Let's go ahead and do the auto run. And here we get a nice VMware Data Recovery installation application, and I can choose to install the VMware Data Recovery vSphere client plugin, or I can explore the media so that I can get access to both the VMware Data Recovery appliance as well as the restore clients like the file level restore client for Windows and Linux. Let's go ahead and explore the media, because really the first thing I want to do is to install the VMware Data Recovery virtual appliance. So inside this VDR ISO file, if I double click on VMware Data Recovery, here you see the OVF file right there, and then here's the VMDK that goes along with it. So all we need to do now is to deploy this OVF file using our vSphere client. Of course, I could either copy these off and put them out on a network share and do it with my local vSphere client, or I could actually just run the vSphere client here on the vCenter server. In my case, I've already copied these off onto a network share, so let me go back to my local desktop in my local vSphere client, and then we'll deploy the OVF file from there. Here in my local vSphere client, to deploy the VDR virtual appliance, I just go up to File and down to Deploy OVF Template. I'll click on that, and then I see the location here of the OVF file that I actually extracted from the VDR ISO. I placed it in this share. If we go into VMware Data Recovery, there it is. There's the VMware Data Recovery OVF file. I'll click Open here, and Next. It tells me that this is VMware Data Recovery version 2.0. It gives us a little bit of information about the size of the virtual appliance before and after it's deployed. Let's go ahead and change the name of the VDR virtual appliance. I'll just call it VDR 2.0, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in the Hilton Head inventory location, that data center in particular. We're going to put it in the HADRS cluster, and I'm going to specify that it be located on host ESX3. I'll say Next here. Now we need to select a destination storage for the virtual machine files. I'm going to store it on the iOmega SAN LUN number 2 because it has the most free space available. I'll click Next here. VMware Data Recovery best practices dictate that this should be a thickly provisioned disk, but just to ensure that this takes as little time as possible for this demonstration, I'm going to make this a thin provisioned disk. Again, that's not recommended in production. I'll click Next here. And then we'll connect this virtual appliance to the default network, the default virtual machine network. Click Next there. We'll set the time zone for the virtual machine. In my case, at the Wire Brain Coffee Company, we're in the Eastern time zone. Click Next, and then Finish. And I don't recommend that you power it on after deployment because most likely you'll want to add a VMDK backup data store. So go ahead and let it deploy. We'll add that data store, and then we can power on the virtual appliance from there. It'll take a few minutes to deploy the VDR virtual appliance, so I'm going to pause the video recording, and I'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and our VDR 2.0 appliance has been successfully deployed. I'm going to click Close here, and then let's go to that appliance. Notice here it's now using CentOS 64-bit, and it is version 2.0. So let's go ahead and edit the settings on this appliance. Because what I want to do is I want to add an additional hard drive, and that's what I'm going to use as my backup repository. So I'll click Add here, and we'll add an additional hard disk. We'll create a new virtual disk, and let's go ahead and make it a 100 gigabyte virtual disk. And normally for production environments, you want to take the default here of a flat disk or a thickly provisioned disk. But again, because this is a lab environment and I want this to happen as quickly as possible, we're going to choose thin. And I'm also going to make it 100 gigabytes just to make sure I have plenty of disk space there. Although, you know, if you think about it, if you had 100 virtual machines out there and each one had on average 8, let's say, gigabytes of actually disk space in use, you might be approaching, you know, the 1 terabyte limit. You still might want to make this like 900 gigabytes, let's say, so that you could make sure you have enough space for all the virtual machine backups, because you'll have multiple copies of those virtual machines, but then you also have data deduplication in place and compression in place to try to squeeze that disk utilization down. For our test, we're just going to make this 100 gigabytes, and I'll say Next here. We'll click Next and Finish. And now we've got a new virtual disk for this virtual appliance. I'll say OK here. And then let's go ahead and power on the virtual machine. With the appliance powered on, let's go to the console for the virtual machine. And then here in the console, you can immediately see that the virtual appliance has an IP address, which it got via DHCP. You can see the IP address for it there. Let's click on the console. I can use my arrow keys here to navigate. I can go ahead and log in, and I'll log in as root with the default password VMware with an @ for the A. And then from here, I can actually change the password. And I'm just going to go ahead and change it to VMware 123 because it's not a dictionary word. This Linux is very particular about you using dictionary words. So I'll type again VMware 123. Of course, you don't want VMware in your password in a production environment. So let's exit out of here, and then we can go down and let's configure the networking on this. I'm going to say no on a static IP address, and let's define a static IP address. I'll type in 10.0.1.242. Take the default netmask, gateway. I'm going to change the DNS server. And I'm going to change the host name to vdr.wiredbraincoffee.com. And we'll say yes here. And we successfully reconfigured our networking. You can see the new IP address there. Now make sure you go over to your Active Directory or your DNS server and you make an alias for the VMware Data Recovery Virtual Appliance, because that is very important for this whole thing to work. So let's just say that I've already done that. At this point, we can open up our web browser and point it to vdr.wiredbraincoffee.com or the IP address of the VDR virtual appliance, but make sure you add on the port number there. See where it says :5480. That's important, and it's also an HTTPS connection. So over here in my web browser, I'm just going to type in https://vdr.wiredbraincoffee.com and then add on :5480. Of course, it's an untrusted connection. We'll add an exception here, confirm the security exception, and here we go. Here's the web interface for the VDR virtual appliance. Again, I'm going to log in as root, and I set my new password to VMware 123. All right, and we've logged in to the virtual appliance. So from here, we can shut it down, we can reboot it, we can go in and configure the time zone. Of course, we already set that. And we can go in and we can modify the network configuration. So you could do it from the web interface. You could also do it from the text-based interface. Honestly, there's not a lot of other things you can do here. That's really it. But I think it's very important to ensure that the DNS is working completely, because you'll be referencing the virtual appliance using the DNS name over in the vSphere client. Speaking of that, now it's time to install the vSphere client plugin for VMware Data Recovery. To do that, let me go over to the Windows share where I copied the VDR vSphere client plugin installer files off of the ISO that I downloaded from VMware.com. All right, so here we go. Here's the VMware OVF that we downloaded, and then here's the VMware Data Recovery plugin. As you can see, it's just a 7 megabyte installation file for Windows. I'm going to double click it. We'll go ahead and run it here. And then it's just a standard installation from here on out. I'll just click Next, Next. I'll click Next to confirm the installation. Takes just a second to install. And there we go. Installation is complete. I'll click Close here. And if you had the vSphere client running when you installed the VDR plugin for the vSphere client, you'll need to close your vSphere client and then reopen it. I've already done that, so let's just restart the vSphere client. And I'll go ahead and log in again. This time we've got a new plugin. So to use our new plugin, we'll go up here to Home, and then look down here underneath Solutions and Applications. This is new right here, VMware Data Recovery. This is new now that we installed the plugin. Those are the results that you should see. So we'll click on that plugin, and then here's where we need to enter either the IP address or the DNS name for the VDR virtual appliance. So I'm going to type in vdr.wiredbraincoffee.com. I'll click Connect here. And then here we need to type in the vCenter administrative username. That's not the same root account that you would log into the VDR virtual appliance with. This is the vCenter administrative username. I'll say OK here. And there we go. We successfully connected to it, and that's when it brings up the Getting Started wizard. So first we have to confirm the IP address for the vCenter server. In this case, it's 10.0.161, and then the administrative username and password for the vCenter server. I'll click Next here because the defaults are just fine. Notice here we've got a 100 gigabyte unmounted, it says a physical disk. It's actually the virtual disk we created before we powered on the VDR virtual appliance. All we need to do to get started using this as our backup destination is first to format it. I'll say OK there. It says it's formatting the volume. And after the format, it was successfully mounted. So we've got a now mounted, formatted, and ready backup destination. Notice up here that we're using a virtual disk to store the virtual machine backups that we'll perform. But you could also use a RDM, or a raw disk mount, or even a Windows or a CIFS network share, a standard network share. So think about that. That network share might be a good option for you to be able to get those backup files off. The RDM might also be a good option for you to get those backup files off. So there's a lot of things to consider here when it comes to the backup destination. But to just get started learning about VDR, perform some backups, and get comfortable with it, in my opinion, the virtual disk is the easiest way to go. I'll click Next here, and then it says we can create a new backup job after completion if we've got this check mark checked right here. Let's go ahead and leave that as the default so we can get started creating a backup job. Alright, so that brings up the backup wizard, and we're just going to call this test job 1. I'll click Next here. And when I talked about earlier in the slides how VDR is a very easy way to back up your entire virtual infrastructure with just a few clicks, this is what I was talking about. Here's the vCenter server, and all you have to do is check that check mark right there, and every virtual machine that comes and goes out of the virtual infrastructure at this point would be backed up with just that one check mark. So you don't have to worry about adding new virtual machines, making sure they're backed up. As long as they're underneath your vSphere virtual infrastructure managed by that vCenter server, they will be backed up with VDR. So that's a very easy way to do it. Now, since this is just a test job, I don't want to back up the entire virtual infrastructure. In fact, I just want to show you a quick backup. So I'm just going to back up the VMware virtual appliance, which I know is relatively small. So hopefully it won't take too long here for our demonstration. I'll click Next here because we're just going to back up that one virtual machine. The destination is going to be our newly mounted virtual disk, our backup repository. I'll click Next there. And here's where I can specify the backup window. And the cool thing about VDR is really because of how it works and its use of snapshots and the vSphere API for data protection, you could really back up your virtual machines anytime you want. You could just do select all right here and run the backup jobs anytime. And in fact, VDR won't back up virtual machines if resource utilization is high on a particular virtual machine or ESXi server. So you don't have to worry about backup slowing down the virtual infrastructure. That is one of the very nice features about VDR. So in my case, let's just back it up anytime. I'll click Next here. And then you can specify the retention policy. So how long do you want to keep these virtual machine backups? And there's some default retention policies here. There's few, there's more, there's many, and then you can create a custom retention policy. And notice how when I clicked on these up here, the retention policy details down here changed. So this is how many backups to retain, how many versions of a particular virtual machine do you want to keep in the backup repository. How many weekly backups do you want to keep of each of those virtual machines? How many monthly backups do you want to keep? How many quarterly backups? And how many yearly backups do you want to retain? I'm going to click Few because I don't want my backup repository to grow too large here in my lab environment. But this is something you need to seriously consider for your virtual infrastructure. How long do you want to keep this backup information? I'll click Next here, and now we're ready to add our new backup job. I'll click Finish. And there we go. There's the new backup job. Notice it just started because I set the execution time to run anytime. So, hey, it needs to run right now. It hasn't run before, and it can run anytime. So it starts backing up the virtual machines that I specified in the job. Now, in this case, it was just one virtual machine. It was the VMware Virtual Appliance, or the vSphere Management Assistant Virtual Appliance, if you're not familiar with that, the free vSphere Management Appliance that you can download from VMware.com. Notice down here it says it's copying the VMware Virtual Appliance. This could take a few seconds or it could take a few minutes. Of course, the first backup is going to be a full complete backup or an archival. Now, after that initial backup, that could take some time. Subsequent backups could take very little time because only those changed blocks will be backed up. Let's give this backup job a few minutes to complete, and I'll be right back as soon as the job is done. Okay, it looks like our backup job is almost done. By the way, if you go to the Reports tab here, you can check the progress of your running task. In this case, this backup job. Notice it's almost done. It's 100% complete, although it still says it's updating the destination index. We could have a completed backup job here any second. And there we go. It says the status now is idle, and the last execution is just a few seconds ago. So we've got a completed backup job for the VMware virtual appliance, the individual virtual machine that I told it to back up right here. You can see we backed up that 5 GB VMware virtual disk, and if we go into the reports here, we can see what events have occurred, and indeed we can see test job 1 completed successfully. There were 0 warnings and 0 errors. If we go into the virtual machines report here, you can see let's see, there's the VMware virtual appliance. It has a last backup date and time. The other virtual machines we haven't backed up yet. So we've got a successful backup of 1 virtual machine. So now let's do a test. Can we delete that virtual machine and then restore it from the VDR backup repository? If we go to Home, let's go to Hosts and Clusters here. There's the VMware virtual appliance. I'm just going to right-click on it. I'm going to power it off. And then now I'm going to right-click on it and go down and delete from disk. So I'm going to completely delete this VMware virtual appliance and all of its associated virtual machine disk files. I'll say yes right there. And let's pretend we had an accidental deletion of a critical virtual infrastructure virtual machine, and end users need that virtual machine back. How are we going to get it back? Well, let's go to Home. Let's go to VMware Data Recovery. Let's go to Restore, and then here's our virtual infrastructure, and it looks like we have a successful backup of the VMware virtual appliance. If we go over here to the virtual infrastructure, you can see it's not here right now. So I'm just going to check that we want to restore the VMware virtual appliance. I'll click Restore right here. We do want to restore the VMware virtual machine. I'll click Next here. And then, again, we're restoring VMware, but we need to select which data store it's going to go on. Let's go ahead and put it on ESX server number 3, iOmega SAN LUN 1. That should be a good place for it. If we scroll over to the right here, we will restore the configuration. We'll reconnect the NIC, and we'll even power it on when it's done. Let's see. We need to also specify the same LUN or the same data store for the VMDK file, and I think we're good to go there. I'll click Next and Restore. And then here in our running task, we've got a restore job running right now, 0% progress, and it is copying the virtual machine disk file back into the virtual infrastructure. We can see on the left-hand side the VMware virtual appliance has been restored. There's the VMware VMDK file. So far it's just copied 9 kilobytes, and we're up to 1 megabyte now. Let's give it just a minute to copy the entire 5 gigabyte virtual machine disk file, and I'll be right back. And as you can see, our running task has disappeared, and that means, hopefully, that our VMware virtual machine has been successfully restored. You see it over on the left-hand side here. If we go to the events log, you can see the VMware task completed successfully. There's the job, 0 warnings and 0 errors. So that looks very good. If we go to the home screen, then to hosts and clusters, there's the VMware virtual appliance. It's back in the virtual infrastructure. It's even powered on. We can open the console, and I can see it's still booting up, but it appears to be successfully restored, and it should be up and running in just a minute or two. So with that, I think we've successfully demonstrated the power of VMware Data Recovery version 2 with some new features in vSphere 5. And that brings us back to the summary for this lesson. So what did we learn? Well, I started off with an introduction to VMware Data Recovery, or VDR, for those who haven't used it before. It's included with most versions of vSphere, and it provides some advanced features like deduplication, compression, and it completely integrates into vSphere and vCenter. It's deployed as a virtual appliance, and it also has a vSphere client plugin that you install to configure backup jobs and restores completely through the vSphere client. I covered the new features of VDR in VDR version 2 with vSphere 5. New features like a new underlying operating system with CentOS 64-bit that should give it better performance, scalability, and stability. Also new greater performance related to integrity checks and backup jobs, and even some email reporting about the success or failure of your backup jobs. I talked about the limitations of VDR, where you can only back up a maximum of 100 virtual machines per VDR virtual appliance, and you can have a maximum of 10 VDR virtual appliances per vCenter server. There's also a maximum limitation, it's really a soft limitation, of 1 terabyte of virtual machine backups per VDR backup repository, and that's deduplicated and compressed virtual machine backups. I showed you how to download VDR, how to mount the ISO file, get the OVF and the vSphere client plugin off of the ISO file that you downloaded, deploy the OVF file, configure the networking, time zone, and change the root password. Add a VMDK virtual disk for the backup repository for the VDR virtual appliance, power on the virtual appliance, and then we install the vSphere client plugin. From there, we performed the VDR initial configuration by formatting the virtual appliance virtual disk that we're using for our backup repository. That mounted it. We created a backup job. We backed up a virtual machine, and then we even deleted that virtual machine and then recovered it or restored it. We had a successful recovery, and we got that virtual machine back up and running in the virtual infrastructure in a matter of a few minutes. Thanks for watching this lesson on VMware Data Recovery version 2.